Welcome to today's webinar, or what we like to call Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host of the Alliance Against Violence in Universities, or AVA's webinar series. My name is Dr. Sarah Yursich, and I'm an early career researcher with AVA, along with being the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children and faculty in Sociology and Criminology at Capilano University. Just a couple of procedural things before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, which is great news because it means you can revisit this resource and any other resource that we have whenever you'd like, and you can share it with friends, family, coworkers. Also, throughout the presentation, you'll notice that the chat is disabled, but the Q&A function is open for you to use. If you have quick tech questions, you're welcome to pop them in there and Jason and I can assist you. Or if you have questions for the presenters, please post those as we go along, and the presenters and I will make time at the end to discuss your questions. Before I begin, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determinations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is intimate partner violence caused brain injury. And we are joined by Karen Mason and Dr. Paul van Donkelaar of Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research, or SOAR. Welcome, Karen, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we would like to acknowledge that much of the work that we've done as part of SOAR has taken place on the unceded and stolen territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation, and we're feeling very privileged to be able to work and live as an invited guest here. So a little bit about me. I have been doing research in neuroscience in general and concussion in particular for about 30 years. I am a professor at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in Kelowna, and I am the co-founder and scientific advisor for SOAR. When I'm not doing research, I love to be out and about rowing in the summertime and cross-country skiing in the winter. And because we live on an off-grid cabin, we spend a lot of our time around this time of year harvesting trees in order to cut them up to feed our wood stove throughout the winter so that we can make it through the winter.
And I'm Karen. I come to this work in a very circuitous manner. I started my career as a journalist and marketing communications expert, and that has served me well in moving into leadership in the nonprofit world. I am a survivor of intimate partner violence. It's not something I kind of shout from the rooftops, but I think it does give me important and valuable perspective in doing this work. So I do like to share it in the context of talks like this. I spent just over 6 years running Kelowna Women's Shelter, which is a women's transition house for women and their kids fleeing violence here in Kelowna, British Columbia. And I am also the co-founder with Paul and executive director for SOAR. SOAR is a registered charity and the only organization in the country with a singular focus on brain injury from intimate partner violence. And while I also love to cross-country ski with Paul and end up chopping and stacking wood with him to keep us warm in the winter, I think the most important and interesting thing about me is that I'm a proud mama to 4 adult humans, 2 dogs and a cat, and we are recently grandparents, which is really, really the best job in the world, I must say.
So just as a preface to what we're going to talk about today, this is a very sensitive issue, and sometimes unpleasant stories and experiences can be shared. So we encourage you to look after yourself. If you need to take a break, please do so. Don't feel like you have to listen to things if they're causing you some concern or worry. And if you do have questions or require support, we can definitely provide our email contacts at the end in case you want to reach out, and I'm sure the same is true for the folks at AVA.
All right, so imagine waking up on the kitchen floor. Your head is pounding. The room is spinning. And you struggle to sit up because everything hurts. And you try to piece together exactly what happened. It had been one of those weeks. Your husband was in one of his moods, finding fault with everything you did, everything the kids did. So you sent the kids to grandma and grandpa's for a sleepover. They love that. And you thought, maybe you'll make a nice meal, have a little date night at home, and just kind of get things back on track. So you sat down for dinner. He took his first mouthful and slammed his fork down on the table, screaming at you that the food had no flavor. So, of course, you jumped up to grab the salt and pepper from the counter. But the next thing you knew, he was behind you, grabbed you by the shoulders, spun you around, and slammed you against the fridge. And that's the last thing that you remember. Now, we'd like to think that that sort of scenario is rare, but it's not. Violence is happening in households across this country every day. And the most recent statistic says almost half of Canadian women and girls will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And we need to consider that that's reported incidents, and so many women never report. So even though almost half sounds pretty high, the reality is it's happening to even more women than that. Every 2 days in this country, a woman or girl is killed violently, usually by a current or former partner or a male family member. And more than 6,000 women and kids flee violence and sleep in shelters every night. We also know that that number doesn't truly represent the number of women and kids who fled violence because so many of our shelters are full. So women end up sleeping at friends' houses or in their car with their kids until they can find somewhere safe to go. In terms of the scope of the problem, women are more than 8 times more likely to be killed than men. 2/3 of us know someone who's a survivor if we aren't one ourselves. Our Indigenous women are 7 times more likely to be killed than non-Indigenous. And I just want to mention the piece about gender. We tend to work mostly with women and gender diverse folks. We know that violence is happening against men as well in intimate relationships, but we do tend to focus our work on women and gender diverse folks really because the scope of the issue and the risk of death and severe harm is much, much higher for women. Generally speaking, we know that our sexual minority women are at much higher risk, particularly transgender women. And the annual cost of intimate partner violence in this country back in 2012 was estimated at $7.4 billion. If we adjust for inflation, we're looking at about $10 billion now.
So most physical incidences of IPV involve blows to the head, face, and neck, including non-fatal strangulation. And although the incidence rates are very, very difficult to determine based on some of the information that Karen has just mentioned, in research studies in participants recruited from emergency departments and women's shelters, up to 92% of survivors of physical intimate partner violence show signs and symptoms or report signs and symptoms that are consistent with a brain injury. So just some background on what causes a concussion, which is one form of brain injury that's common in intimate partner violence. So it can be defined very generally as an alteration in brain function caused by external forces. And so it can be caused by a hard blow or a jolt to the head, neck, or body that causes the head to move and the brain to move rapidly back and forth. And sometimes that movement of the brain within the cranium will lead to neurons being stretched and strained, and sometimes even physically breaking. And that stretching and straining disrupts the communication between neurons in the brain, and that's how our brain functions, by transmitting information between neurons. So how can it happen in the context of intimate partner violence? So survivors can be punched or hit in the head with an object. They can be kicked in the head, they can be violently shaken, they can be pushed down the stairs or thrown against a solid surface. They can be thrown out of a moving vehicle. And a big one that makes brain injury and intimate partner violence different from almost every other brain injury mechanism is the presence of non-fatal strangulation. So nearly half of survivors have experienced this, and it can have quite significant consequences in terms of brain function.
So we know that strangulation cuts off the oxygen to the brain. So it causes what's called a hypoxic or an anoxic injury. And it really is the ultimate exercise of power and control in an intimate partner violence relationship. It takes very little pressure to close off that supply of oxygen to the brain, and it can cause brain injury and death within minutes. Statistically, we know that women who are strangled are 750%, that's 7.5 times, more likely to be murdered on a subsequent incident. Now, while we don't expect everyone to be diagnosing or to be, physicians, it is important for all of us, especially those working on the front lines, to know what to look for, because if you can identify a possible case of strangulation, you may be able to refer somebody for more support. So some signs and symptoms that strangulation has happened include a raspy voice. Now, of course, if you've never met this person before, you don't know what their voice normally sounds like. But if it's the first time you have met them and you notice they have a particularly raspy voice, you could literally say something as simple as, "Susan, I notice you have a really husky, raspy voice. Is that how you usually sound?" Now, she might say yes, but there's a chance she'll say, "Actually, it's funny you ask. My voice has done this for about a week now." That's a red flag for you to pursue a conversation about whether strangulation may have occurred and whether she might be at risk. She might report trouble swallowing, breathing. She might say she has ringing in the ears, red spots in the whites of the eyes or on the skin, which are called petechiae, which are burst blood vessels from that incident. Perhaps there's bruising on the neck or scratches, which would be from a defense mechanism trying to remove hands or a body part or a ligature. Reporting loss of memory. Now, loss of consciousness is absolutely a sign, and generally we don't know if we've lost consciousness. So you might notice, though, in her telling her story that she says, "It's funny. The last thing I remember, I was in the kitchen, but I woke up in the hallway." That's another red flag that she's lost consciousness and perhaps he's moved her. Involuntary urination or defecation is another thing that can happen in strangulation. For anyone who's on the call, who's involved in policing or any response to domestic violence, always you want to ask at the scene, are those the clothes you were wearing at the time of the assault? Because if she becomes conscious and recognizes that she has defecated in her clothing, the first thing she's going to do is have a shower and change her clothes. And if the investigators don't ask that question about clothing, there could be important evidence sitting in a hamper in the other room. And most importantly, when we're talking about strangulation, in half of cases, there could be no visible signs and symptoms, but there may have been a dissection of the carotid artery, which can lead to stroke in the days, weeks, and months after an incident. So imagine you hear about, a 32-year-old mom of 3 who died by stroke, and everyone says, "Oh, how unfortunate, she was so young." What if there had been an investigation to see if perhaps she'd experienced strangulation and an injury from that months before? The Family Justice Center and the Institute for Strangulation Prevention out of San Diego have a ton of really great resources on strangulation, and they're all free on their website. And we're happy to share our presentation afterwards because we do have a lot of resources that we share in this presentation, and we don't want everyone to think they have to scribble them all down. And I know there's also will be a recorded version of this presentation that's shared afterwards.
So what are some of the signs and symptoms that a brain injury can cause? This is in the most general sense, although it can also apply to folks that have experienced intimate partner violence. So headaches is a big one. A lot of folks who have a brain injury will have if they don't normally have headaches, they'll have headaches that last days or so after a brain injury. Fatigue, dizziness, insomnia, worries and fears, so emotional dysregulation. And then another big one is sensitivity to noise and light. And so those are all things that happen in brain injury. In the context of intimate partner violence, it's important to try and disentangle these from some of the other psychopathological comorbid factors that can also cause some of these signs and symptoms. So things like PTSD, depression, and anxiety.
So if you're working with a survivor, the way challenges from brain injury might manifest was this list here. Perhaps it seems like they're not listening. They're easily distracted. They might have difficulty learning things or following instructions or following through on tasks. Perhaps they forget appointments and chores. Maybe they get tired and irritated easily. They get angry. They seem to be raging all the time at their kids, other people. They might have issues adapting when things change, and they might change their story frequently. So imagine if you're dealing with a survivor or just a client in any way, and they're having all these challenges. If you don't consider brain injury, you might just be really frustrated with them. So that sort of leads to the backstory of how Paul and I came together and started doing this work. 10 years ago now, I was a few years out of a very long-term abusive relationship and decided I was ready to try and find love again. So I went online and I swiped right on this handsome fella. And I guess he swiped right too. And we went for a fabulous dinner date and talked for hours and went for a long walk. And that was it. Game over. We've been together ever since. And at the time, I was running a women's shelter, and Paul was studying athletes who had experienced concussion. But a few months into the relationship, this article crossed my desk. This article connecting domestic violence and brain injury. And I had my light bulb moment because I thought about all those women we served who were displaying the behaviors that were on that slide a couple slides ago. Perhaps they didn't do their chores in the shelter. They seemed to be up at odd hours or sleeping at odd hours. They didn't get along with other residents and staff. They kept forgetting when they were supposed to be there for an appointment for counseling or a trauma session. They complained of having headaches all the time. So, what if those women had brain injury? And what if we didn't know and we weren't serving them? And I realized so many of those women who seemed to have extreme behavioral problems had been put on red lists across the community and couldn't get into any shelter because they were difficult, because they were oppositional. And I was horrified to even consider this because I'm running a shelter, I'm hiring staff, I'm working with clients, I'm going to conferences. This intersection with brain injury, although it's so logical, had never come up. So, of course, I sent this article to my wonderful new boyfriend and basically said, "What the heck are you doing studying athletes? We need to study women."
So I did what every good scientist does. I looked in the literature and used PubMed to search, what I expected to be hundreds or thousands of articles on this issue, and quickly discovered that there was hardly any research on it, other than a small pocket of research from a small number of researchers around the world. And so it represented an opportunity, but also a need in terms of trying to better understand this issue and create better supports for survivors. So together we formed SOAR, Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research. It's now a registered charity and the only organization in Canada with a singular focus on brain injury due to intimate partner violence. We launched it almost 10 years ago now, and it's got three main goals. The first is to explore or to characterize the incidence and effects of brain injury and intimate partner violence. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the research around the basic kind of mechanistic science that we do to better understand this issue. A second big component is educate, which is kind of what this is, which is to educate and train those who work with survivors or come into contact survivors so that they're more aware of the fact that brain injury is likely happening and take that into account in the supports that they provide. And then the third main goal is to empower, which is to create better awareness and support services for survivors themselves. So the next few slides, I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of some of the research that we've published on the topic. So these are just some screenshots from three papers over the last few years that have looked at participants who are at what we call the chronic remote stage. So these are participants that we recruit through places like Kelowna Women's Shelter, where it's been maybe months or years since their most recent episode of intimate partner violence. So we recruit them through the shelter, we bring them up to the lab at UBCO, and we do a bunch of basically clinical research assessments, many of which we've used previously in young athletes who are at the acute stage after a sport-related concussion. So just to give you a summary of what that research has found, across all the participants that we recruited into the study, which is now getting close to about 130, I believe, almost all of them have experienced at least one brain injury or endorsed signs and symptoms consistent with one brain injury from an episode of intimate partner violence. And many of them have had multiple potential brain injuries from this experience. Those that have had non-fatal strangulation as part of that experience tend to be exposed to a greater extent to more episodes, more severe episodes, more recent episodes of potential brain injury from intimate partner violence. Karen mentioned previously that intimate partner violence is something that happens at increased rates in Indigenous women, and this was confirmed in this group of participants. So even though we weren't explicitly attempting to recruit Indigenous participants, they were overrepresented in the data set or in the cohort that we were able to recruit. So 20% of our participants were Indigenous versus 7% in the general population in the area. One thing that is an advantage of having come from the world of research on acute sport-related concussion is we have lots of data that we've collected with which to compare. And so one thing that we did was to do an assessment of self-endorsed symptoms of potential brain injury that the current person is currently experiencing when we bring them into the lab to do the assessments. And what we found is that in the survivors of intimate partner violence, they had a greater number of symptoms than that observed in acute sport-related concussion. So clearly this is chronic in terms of the effects on their day-to-day life. We made use of a number of different techniques in the lab to assess different aspects of brain function. And so one tool that we used assess kind of cognitive motor performance. And so we found that in this task that required fast coordinated movements that really probes aspects of executive function and spatial attention, that more exposure to brain injury from intimate partner violence led to reduced ability in that task. They also showed reduced postural control, so they're a little less stable on their feet, and then also reduced cerebrovascular function, so brain blood flow to the brain itself. And I mentioned in passing in a previous slide that it's important to take into account the mental health comorbid factors and how they might contribute to this. And we absolutely found that although brain injury from intimate partner violence was absolutely contributing the most to some of these deficits, these mental health comorbid factors, things like post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression, also were modulating some of these functions. And so it's really important to take kind of the holistic whole picture of what's going on in these participants to understand what their experience has been. So as a bottom line, many of them have had multiple repeated brain injuries that led to chronic symptoms and very likely has long-term consequences. So a more recent thing that we've been doing in collaboration with colleagues in Australia and in the Lower Mainland is to look at the acute subacute stage. So this is recruiting people either through an emergency department or through a specialized clinic in the Lower Mainland called Embrace Clinic, which is one of the few clinics in Canada that supports survivors of gender-based violence. And we basically asked, what are they endorsing in terms of signs and symptoms of brain injury when we see them within a few days or a week of the most recent episode? And then can we measure pathophysiological consequences of this by doing blood biomarker analysis? And so from the Embrace Clinic patients, in terms of a retrospective chart review, we found that non-fatal strangulation was occurring very frequently in those clients, and that experience led to them being 2.3 times more likely to report brain injury symptoms. Overall, brain injury symptoms were disclosed in 31% of the cases that we reviewed. And this was despite the fact that the intake form at the time didn't directly ask questions about brain injury. And so even it was basically them self-reporting and bringing up the fact that they had these signs and symptoms on their own. From the work with our colleagues in Australia, where they did a blood draw in patients that showed up at the emergency room after an experience of intimate partner violence, we found evidence of increased concentrations of a blood biomarker that was consistent with axonal disruption in these patients within 72 hours of their injury. So the bottom line of this area of research is that there's clear direct evidence that at the acute subacute stage that brain injury is occurring in women experiencing intimate partner violence.
So the other key piece of the work we're doing is sessions like this, as Paul mentioned, and we've also developed an online training module called the Women's Support Worker module of the Concussion Awareness Training Tool. The Concussion Awareness Training Tool was developed by the folks at the BC Injury Research Prevention Unit in Vancouver and led by Dr. Shalina Baboul out of that department and University of British Columbia in Vancouver. It's a 35 to 45-minute online course on recognizing and responding to brain injury from intimate partner violence. When we first started developing it, we were thinking that it would be for women's shelter workers, but it became clear as we developed the content that this really needed to be more of an introduction to intimate partner violence caused brain injury that would be useful for anybody. So it's available in French and English. It's free to take. You get a certificate at the end, which is nice. And it really is a great introduction, so highly recommend checking that out. We've also developed some educational brochures. The Moving Ahead Guide to Brain Injury and Intimate Partner Violence is a basic introduction. It's really clearly and concisely written in a conversational style. We had support from survivors and gender-based violence sector workers in developing this and getting it out there. So there's one for survivors and one for frontline workers. And as part of that, we endorse a version of the HELPS brain injury screening tool that we've adapted very slightly to include the topic of strangulation. The original version of this validated tool, which is very widely used in the brain injury sector, doesn't, of course, include strangulation. It was really developed in the context of sports concussion. But we surveyed frontline shelter workers across the country, and they liked this tool because it's quick and easy, it's simple, you don't have to have medical expertise to use it. And we recommend that folks working on the front lines get to know this assessment such that they can use it just in a conversation with someone, as opposed to a formalized, structured assessment. We also have a brochure specific to strangulation because it is now becoming so much more common and it is so dangerous. We developed a brochure on strangulation, again, one for workers, one for survivors. Folks working in the gender-based violence sector have told us they are seeing and hearing about more incidents and more severe incidents of strangulation. We're seeing a lot more and hearing a lot more about it happening in dating violence with young folks. I think that's partly because strangulation has almost been normalized because of its prevalence in pornography and in mixed martial arts, where athletes are literally training in how to choke each other out or to strangle each other to unconsciousness. Now we're sort of throwing a lot of information at you, but I think it's important to think about what we can do with that information. Now that we know that brain injury is a factor for almost all women who experience physical intimate partner violence, what can we as frontline workers or people who know them do to help? If we know a woman's been strangled, it's important to ensure that she hasn't experienced that dissection of the carotid artery, whether she has signs and symptoms of any other pieces from strangulation or not. So you can refer for medical attention if there is concern that she's been strangled, because that is a massive red flag for future harm. You can use an adapted version of the HELPS tool to chat through whether someone might have experienced a brain injury. You can speak way more slowly than I do. We're trying to cram a lot into this session, so I'm speaking pretty quickly, but it's really important to slow your speech and to make sure you're enunciating well in order to provide them the ability to understand. You want to take breaks. Survivors of brain injury are not going to be able to sit with you and go through forms or listen to information without breaks. In order to ensure that this person is understanding what you are communicating, it's really great to ask them to repeat information back to you. Rather than asking, have you heard or have you understood, to which most people will say yes because they're ashamed to admit if they haven't, it's great to just ask them to repeat the information back so that you know they've understood what you're talking about. Paul mentioned how sensitivity to light and noise can be very common responses from brain injury. If you're able to dim the lights or move to a quieter location when you're working with someone, that can be really helpful. You want to work with them if you have a bunch of forms they need to fill out, or perhaps if your organization has volunteers, that's something that volunteers can do and be really useful in working with these survivors. You want to minimize computer use or tablet use. You don't want to sort of, give them a bunch of URL addresses and say, go to these addresses and find out information or fill out forms. That's going to be really difficult and can be very overwhelming for someone who's experienced brain injury. You want to encourage rest. Um, if there's issues like memory and forgetting appointments and not following through, work with this person to help them prioritize or set tasks and appointments. Perhaps you can help them set alarms on their phone or put things into their calendar. Maybe you can have a supply on hand of small day timers that a local printing company has donated, so you can write appointments down in the day timer for them. And following up, if you have an appointment with someone that day, give them a quick call or text. Plan that in your schedule in case they've forgotten so that they have that extra support. You can also have earplugs, sunglasses, and hats around. If you can't dim the lights or move to a quiet location, these can be great options for someone who's dealing with those challenges as the result of violence and a possible brain injury. You can refer them to a brain injury support agency in your community. Many of our communities across Canada have these. Did I just go two slides?
Yes.
I thought so. All right. Sorry about that. So I just want to talk a minute about how we speak to people. So often it's how we say things that can really make a difference. And it's really important when we're working with survivors to consider our language and to use language and words that will resonate for them. So for instance, if we're talking to a survivor and maybe we're doing an intake or just an interview, the words brain injury can be daunting and can be a little scary. So you might want to use words like, I'm concerned you might have hurt your head is the most basic way of having that conversation without having to say brain injury. We've also found that in working with survivors, sometimes if you ask, have you ever had a concussion? They'll say no. Or has anyone strangled you? They'll say no. They might understand choking because people tend to use that word, even though we know that's not the technical term, because choking is when something blocks your airway from inside. But if we describe what happened and its implications, we're much more likely to get the information we need if this has occurred. So instead of, did your partner ever do something that gave you a concussion? You might say, has your partner ever done something that left you dizzy or seeing stars? And then for strangulation, you might say, has your partner ever put their hands or another body part or something on or around your throat and made it hard to breathe? Then they might say yes. So I just think it's really important for all of us to consider this. If you're working in the world of academia, there does tend to be, just like in any sector, a tendency to use the jargon of your sector. It isn't necessarily jargon that people in the real world will understand. So I just want to emphasize the importance of plain language and using words that will resonate for the folks we're working with. In terms of other ways you can help, we really want to focus on being trauma informed. So it really shifts that focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Understanding that there's nothing wrong with this person, they're not choosing poor behaviors, something happened to them that has led to some behaviors and challenges for them. It's really about centering the survivor because they are the expert in their own experience. And we really want to suspend judgment. We want to leave our judgment at the door because what we think we know, what we want for the person, it's all completely irrelevant because we need to center them, not what we think. And it really tries to avoid re-traumatizing them by forcing them to tell their story over and over again, etc. So some key pieces Paul was talking about before, that trauma and being in an intimate partner violence relationship can cause PTSD. Trauma and its effects are legitimate, and we really need to recognize that. If people are experiencing some of these things, it's not their fault, it's a result of what was done to them. So post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, always operating up here because I want to protect myself. Anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation, and memory loss, as Paul mentioned, these things happen because of brain injury and they happen because of trauma. So you've got a double layer of challenges that these survivors are dealing with. So we really want to emphasize safety, not just the physical, but the emotional safety and the psychological safety. We want to create opportunities for survivors to make their own choices. they have had their sense of personal agency and self-determination eroded over often many years. So every opportunity we have to help them make choices and rebuild that is really important. It can be as simple as when you walk into a room with someone, just saying, please sit where you like, as opposed to sitting in a chair and not giving them much choice. It can be as simple as, Susan, I know we have 3 forms we have to work through today. Form 1 is about this, Form 2 is about this, Form 3 is about this. Which one would you like to tackle first? By giving that choice and control back to the other person, we're helping rebuild that sense of personal agency. And for us in our work, it's really just about rethinking how we do our work and finding ways to accomplish our goals and just going out at it a little differently. So we want to meet people where they're at, not where we think they should be or want them to be. So some ways we can do that is by acknowledging that what has happened is violent. Survivors will make excuses. They will say, it's my fault. I know he doesn't like that pasta dish. I shouldn't have made it. Or his father died this year. He's been having a rough time. And we can say, Jane, you may have a point. At the same time, what he's doing is violent and it's not okay. And she will say, oh, but he's never hit me. It's just words. And you can say, you know what? That's violent. We can play that role and help her understand that what's going on is not okay because she's normalized it, because she lives it every day. You want to be clear she's not at fault. And you want to honor her resistance because leaving a violent relationship isn't a singular moment in time. It happens over months and years. And moments like we discussed at the beginning, where she sent her kids to grandma and grandpa's, that's a moment of resistance. On some level, she knew that things might go sideways because it's happened before. So she sent them to grandma and grandpa's and was incredibly brave and exhibiting great parenting by doing so. We can take those moments and celebrate them with her so that she understands that she shouldn't have shame that it took her so long to leave, because she did all these things along the way to keep herself and her kids safe. Obviously, in our society, we're really bad at victim blaming. We want to challenge those messages. She will use them, and we want to make sure that we're not using them too. Let her judge her choices. She's making the best decisions she can in the moment for herself. And most importantly, we want to listen and we want to support. Here's just a list for you, some things that are really great to have in your back pocket. You can practice these phrases and use them when you're working with someone. They are trauma-informed and non-judgmental. And I want to particularly emphasize the 4th bullet point there, because it's one of my favorite ways to respond when you're supporting someone or working with someone, is with one of those who, what, where, when, why, how questions, because they're open-ended and they are trauma-informed because they are giving voice to this person. Rather than asking a question that has a yes or no answer, you want to ask an open question that puts it in their court to tell you what they need. So how can I help? What do you need from me right now? What would it look like if we sat down and talked about this for a while? How would you feel about? So really rethinking again the goals of our work or conversations and how we can get to them in a way that's trauma informed and really centers the survivor. Now, here are some things that you don't want to say. And we recognize these come often from a very caring place, from a place of wanting to help. Well, you should leave him. He hit you. Why haven't you left? These absolutely come from a place of true concern, and yet they're not trauma informed. You are shaming the victim in some respects. You're blaming the victim. You may think they should leave, and that's not up to you to decide. You have to call the police. Why didn't you go to the hospital? We know that survivors would have very good reasons for not calling the police or going to the hospital. Our systems of care that are supposed to be there to support us don't always do a good job. Our Indigenous friends, our queer friends, they may not have had good experiences with police or healthcare systems. There's a survivor we worked with who showed up at an emergency room with her head split open. They treated her like she was drunk or high. never thought to separate her from her partner and talk to her about possible brain injury from intimate partner violence. We also know that it's a little late for marriage counseling, so suggesting marriage counseling is not the greatest idea. And the last one here, I always thought he was such a great guy. The reality is, out there in the world, he probably seems like a great guy. Often these perpetrators are funny and witty, and they seem kind. They give to charity. They probably coach their kids' sports teams. They're the life of the party. They're the guy everyone wants at the neighborhood barbecue. But none of that is relevant to what's really happening in her life and behind closed doors. And when someone says, "Oh, wow, I always thought he was such a great guy," you're saying you don't believe her and you're not being trauma informed and supportive. We could talk about these for days, but we don't have time. So those are just some to think about. Now, if you do, of course, because you know about this topic, think, wow, we need to get her to the hospital because I'm worried her head might be really hurt, or maybe she was strangled and there's something else going on. There is a way to do it in a trauma-informed way without sounding judgy. For instance, from what you've told me, Susan, I'm worried that you might have hurt your head. How would you feel if we went to the clinic together? I'm expressing concern. I'm offering an option. I'm doing it in a way that starts with, how would you feel if, so that she gets to make the decision. So again, it's about reframing how we position things. Now we're going to just go over some resources for you. The Abused and Brain Injured Toolkit is a fabulous website developed by our colleagues at the University of Toronto. It has information for survivors, for frontline workers, tons of great resources in here. It's a deep dive into the topic of brain injury from intimate partner violence. This is a brochure from our friends at the Ohio Valley Center for Brain Injury Prevention and Rehabilitation. This is not specific to intimate partner violence, but if you're going to be interacting with and working with survivors of brain injury, there's some incredible stuff in here about how to accommodate some of these challenges we've talked about. We showed you the Adapted Helps tool. This is something called the chat tool that was developed by the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, specifically for use in women's shelter and advocacy contexts. It's free on their website in English and Spanish. Feel free to check that out. And if you want to start incorporating use of that into your practice, that's great.
For strangulation, the Institute for Addressing Strangulation has guidelines for the clinical management of non-fatal strangulation. So really, getting that into the healthcare system and the different questions and assessments that clinicians can do if they suspect that someone has been strangled.
And then this is from our friends at the University of Western Ontario. If you're not already following them, they have all kinds of great training and resources on gender-based violence. And if you want to learn more about trauma-informed and violence-informed care, they have some wonderful pieces on their website. And then we have a number of national resources. Women's Shelters Canada, I'm sure many of you are aware of this organization, which represents shelters across the country. They have a website called Shelter Safe, which has a map of Canada, and you can find where there are support services. Brain Injury Canada is an incredible resource for information, but also to find out if there is a brain injury support agency in your community. Brain Injury Canada is a great place to start if you don't know the answer to that question and you want to refer somebody.
There's a number of different organizations that focus on kind of the research side of things. So the Enigma International Consortium Working Group on Brain Injury and Intimate Partner Violence is a great group that includes both kind of a research synopsis and overview component, as well as actual kind of group science or large studies that incorporate data from a number of different researchers. They also have a knowledge kind of network, a monthly meeting where they bring in experts who provide support and care for survivors, specifically in the context of brain injury, to have a really kind of informal back and forth with advocates, researchers, survivors themselves about what can be done to provide better support for folks experiencing this issue. So it's a really great organization, both from a research as well as a clinical care support perspective. And then Pink Concussions has a partner-inflicted brain injury task force group. So again, similar idea, monthly meetings and webinars where the issue of IPVBI is the main focus. And they also have some peer support groups that work with survivors who've gone through this experience, just so they can share those experiences with each other.
Yeah, so if you're working with survivors, they can join. They have a number of Facebook peer support groups specifically for women survivors of brain injury. So recommend those. And these two groups, Enigma and Pink Concussions, have partnered to put on an online conference on intimate partner violence brain injury. We're currently planning the third iteration of that, and it'll be happening in early November. So if you check out the Enigma website or the Pink Concussions website and you want to sign up, it's a free online conference, and it's kind of all the latest and greatest information and research that's happening in this area, both in Canada and around the world, because it's definitely grown since we started doing this work 9 or 10 years ago.
So this work wouldn't be possible without some of the funding that we received over the years, including a major grant from Women and Gender Equality. And then more recently, we were successful in getting a big grant from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so that funding is used to support trainees and research staff that carry out all of the work. And also I'd like to mention all of the collaborators at other research institutions and community organizations.
And this is how to reach us. That's both of our email addresses there. We're always keen to hear from folks. And if people want to have some targeted training for their organization or their community, we're always happy to do that. And we're very active on social media with SOAR. So please follow us on your socials. We got off the hellscape of Twitter a few months ago, so we're now on Blue Sky, which is a much happier place to be. And you can find us there. And I think we're ready for questions. We were told 45 minutes, and I think we're a couple over, and then some time for questions. So please, Sarah, let us know if we have some questions coming in, or if anyone wants to put them in the chat, or unmute yourself and just ask. We'd love to chat about this more with you.
Absolutely. I don't see any questions yet, but I'm sure people are kind of getting their thoughts together at the end.
Yeah, that was a lot in a short time.
But such important information. I really enjoyed learning the range of what you do, but also kind of the personal story that brought you to this work.
Mm-hmm.
So while we're seeing if questions kind of come in, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about things like structural changes or changes in policy and practice that you think would really help not only elevate your work, but address these issues more meaningfully.
Yeah, where to begin?
Yeah.
It's a big question, I know.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the initial thrust of that, creating better supports was in the context of women's shelters and frontline staff at women's shelters. So I think they're more informed and aware now, and you can certainly see that in, whenever we have any interactions with folks that work in that sector. The interesting thing about that is that intimate partner violence, gender-based violence is the given. It's the assumption when someone shows up for support through places like women's shelters. And so then all you're doing is adding on awareness and knowledge about brain injury in that context, and getting staff, feeling confident that they can have those conversations and hopefully make some appropriate referrals. It gets a little bit harder when you go, and I'm sure you guys are all aware of this in the work you do, when you go into other sectors like policing or first responders or the justice system or the healthcare system. There, I think there's there's high barriers around even talking about intimate partner violence, especially for folks that are, maybe more general in the supports they provide. And so then the idea of bringing brain injury to the conversation is it's almost too much, right? And so I think we've started to have those conversations around how do we raise awareness of IPV in general, and then IPVBI in particular in some of those sectors where it's not a given or an assumption of the supports that they provide.
Mm-hmm. Because when you talk about support for, say, an athlete who's received a concussion, there's a really clear pathway onto which a person is placed. So, I fall, I hit my head, somebody witnesses the injury, I'm immediately put into this pathway of care. I have my bit of rest, I have my rehabilitation, and then there's a, return to play protocol or a return to work protocol, depending on the context of my injury. We don't have a return to life protocol for these survivors. And often they're single moms, often they are, trying to retain employment while they're dealing with these challenges. They're trying to get and maintain safe housing. They might be dealing with family court. They might be dealing with issues with custody or access to their kids. So there's this whole area of kind of systemic services of sport that doesn't even really exist yet. And that's the thing we keep banging into is the more we increase awareness of this issue, the more it becomes apparent that the system doesn't yet support. So part of what we're looking at is how do we support creations of specific targeted concussion and other brain injury guidelines that every medical professional is familiar with and can deal with just like they would with a sports concussion. How do we ensure that our healthcare system will fund treatment for these survivors? Because they sometimes need more care, more time. And right now, to get a diagnosis of brain injury months or years after the incident is not easy. Because when you diagnose, how do you diagnose a concussion?
There has to be a plausible mechanism of injury, and then endorsement of signs and symptoms as an initial kind of assessment to say, yeah, you probably had a concussion, and then follow-up assessments that may be more specialized. And in the ideal world, comparing to the context or the basically how the person was before. So that's the appeal of sport-related concussion, is that if a young hockey or football player gets a concussion, quite often they've had some form of preseason assessment, and they can compare that to how they performed previously and say, yeah, you're having a lot more difficulty with concentration or your balance or whatever. And take the appropriate steps in terms of care following that. That doesn't exist for intimate partner violence. We don't have really
Baseline.
assessments of people who are experiencing this, and so it's a huge barrier to be able to be confident that you can diagnose a brain injury in this population.
Mm-hmm. And with intimate partner violence, brain injury, there's often no witnesses, or if there are witnesses, it's the perpetrator and maybe the children. It's not like a sports event where a whole bunch of people see this thing happen and can confirm, yes, so and so hit her head and therefore. So it makes it really difficult, apart from all the shame and stigma and that nobody wants to talk about this. But the numbers, as we showed, are such that we have to talk about it. We must do something because there are tens of thousands of women walking around and dealing with brain injury and the challenges of it, and many of them don't even recognize.
Absolutely. And all of those are such important points, but Paul, you raised something for me that reminded me of a question I was thinking of asking you kind of midway through, or that came up for me midway through the presentation. I know that before getting into the work you're doing now, you worked a lot on sports-related brain injury. What were the biggest shifts you saw sort of in like the work that you're doing as you moved from sports injuries to intimate partner violence related injuries?
Um, to Well, it sounds awful, but be more sensitive to the context of the participant. Like, acute sport-related concussion work is it's important. Don't get me wrong. Like, kids playing sports, especially collision sports, let's make that as safe as possible. And if they do get injured, let's do the appropriate steps so that they're getting the care they need and can hopefully recover and get back into their sport. Um, from a scientific clinical perspective, it's a really nice model because you have these mostly otherwise healthy individuals, and you have this opportunity because they play these sports that concussion occurs, to be able to do the baseline testing. And so you can ask really clear-cut mechanistic scientific questions. And it's about as clean as you can get from a science perspective to be able to address this clinical issue. All of that goes out the door in intimate partner violence. And there's all these other factors that contribute. And so one of my kind of mantras that I talk to my grad students about is embrace the complexity, right? Like let's measure everything that we think is relevant, and much more relevant in IPV. And then, use some fancy statistics to try and determine how much each of those things contributes to how the person is functioning, in today, right? And so I think the science is definitely, advancing in terms of understanding of the issue and the effects of potential brain injury from intimate partner violence. And the next big step is, what do we do about it? Like, what do you do about it from a clinical care perspective? It kind of falls into, this category of complex medical situations or patients, right, where they have lots of comorbid factors, lots of contributing factors that make care really complex. Um, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? And so I think all of a sudden these pictures become really big, or the questions become really big, like how do we change the healthcare system so that it's not so siloed, and that have a team of specialists that can provide care for all the different things that are happening to this person, as opposed to they tore their ACL, so we get the orthopedic surgeon in there and we fix it and get them rehabilitated, and they're off and
Off they go.
everything's fine, right?
Yeah.
And so nothing like that is apparent in IPV and brain injury.
I remember when Paul and I first came upon this and decided to do this work, we'd have these very long conversations around it. And Paul initially was like, well, no problem. We're going to bring the survivors up to the lab and we're going to do a bunch of assessments and everything. And I'm like, absolutely not. But again, coming from that trauma-informed place of, first we need to train all of your trainees about intimate partner violence and trauma-informed practice and language if they're going to be working with survivors. But again, if safety's paramount, putting a survivor in a cab or on a bus and sending her up to a university lab to deal with this, that's a lot. So when we first developed the program of research, it was very important that we had a research coordinator who was embedded in both worlds. So she worked part-time at Kelowna Women's Shelter directly with survivors as a frontline worker, and part-time as a research coordinator for Paul at UBC. So initially she did the recruitment. She would interview and do the assessments at the shelter where the women felt safe and comfortable, where they had other supports in place should they get triggered. And then she would go with them to the lab and would actually show them ahead of time videos of the sorts of things they'd be doing in the lab so that they were prepared, so they could be comfortable. And then we made sure there was only ever one other person in the lab. All these pieces that normally in doing this base scientific research, you'd never even consider because you didn't need to. So that I think has been a real, again, changing, just reframing how you do your work and achieving the same goals and objectives, but just getting there differently in order to create that sense of safety when you're dealing with a population that's kind of already vulnerable.
As a male researcher, I made a point of never just spontaneously dropping by the lab when a participant was being tested, because that was a surprise, right? And maybe not something they would expect and could potentially be triggering for them in some way.
Absolutely. And the points you raise about context, especially like the injury in and of itself may seem the same, but all those contextual pieces are so important. I do see Andrea has her hand up. Andrea, do you have a question?
I do. You talk about baseline assessments in sports, but we know that women go in and out of shelters depending on how the escalation occurs. Is there any kind of baseline assessment that's set up?
No,
No.
but it's an interesting point. So because research in this area is really still in its infancy, almost all research has been kind of one point in time where you do all the assessments. And so I think a really interesting approach would be to do more longitudinal studies where you get people back in to do assessments over the course of several years. And, if you have a large enough pool of participants, some of those participants may exit an abusive relationship and then go into a different one or back to the same one. And so, from a scientific perspective, it does create an opportunity to look at, here's where they were at before. And, they had some recovery when you measured the second time, but then they went into a second abusive relationship and maybe had one or more subsequent episodes. And here's where their function is now 2 years later. And that allows us to get a little bit more at the cause and effect than we would otherwise just by measuring them at one point in time.
Yeah. In a perfect world, but we know many of these survivors end up being transient. Perhaps they're moving for safety. Often they're moving for safety, and they may leave shelter and go to a completely different community. They may leave because they have better job opportunities somewhere else, or they go back to live with family. It's pretty hard to follow survivors from shelter. So we've been doing a lot more consideration about how we can work more closely with some of our second stage or longer term housing providers to provide support on this. But also, you know, it's funny, this baseline conversation I was having just earlier this morning, and thinking the only way we could actually do this is to baseline test girls when they're about 12 and then follow them through. And statistically, the numbers are so high, it's going to happen to probably half of them at least. But from a scientific perspective, the rigor is more difficult when you're working with all these other contexts, for sure.
It's not impossible though. So there is a model.
Yeah.
It's not intimate partner violence, but it's a project that's been going on for over 10 years now in Vancouver, with colleagues at UBC Vancouver on the downtown east side, looking at health outcomes and you know, brain function dysfunction in people experiencing homelessness. And so they've managed to recruit a cohort of participants that's, I think, like 300 or 400 people, and retain them over the last decade, and have them come in at various points in time, either to do like questionnaire type assessments on site, or go up to the Vancouver campus to do assessments of various aspects of brain function. And you know, they've shown pretty clearly that brain injury is part of that experience, and it's, you know, it's modulated by all the other confounders that are quite common in people experiencing homelessness. But brain injury is absolutely, you know, contributing in a significant way. And probably one of the most interesting findings they found is that when a person has a brain injury, if they've been unstably housed up until that point, they're much more likely to fall into homelessness after the brain injury, which just supports the fact that, you know, you need your brain functioning at a certain level in order to just do that kind of basic necessities of life support. And when that gets disrupted, it can be challenging.
I think we're beyond out of time at this stage. We're so grateful to have had this opportunity to speak to all of you, and we do welcome anyone getting in touch. The QR code that's on the screen now is a survey for us at SOAR that we helps us give feedback to our funders, which is really important. So I'm hopeful we can actually send out the link later to everyone who registered as well, just in case we lost some folks. But that is a QR code that'll get you to our survey. And then I know, I think there's a survey in the chat from our friends at Ava as well. And I'll stop talking now because you probably have some wrap-up things you want to say.
Well, from us, the wrap-up thing is a big thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. It was such an important topic, and it's always so interesting for me, and I know for everyone who attends these, to learn a lot more about the nuances and the context of these issues. So thank you so much, both for your time and the important work that you do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And on the screen, you'll see a QR code to our survey. It is also in the chat for you. If you just want to click on the Survey Monkey, that would be great. And let us know about your webinar experiences, anything you might want to see in the future. And we appreciate you attending.